All right, should be good to go. So hello, thank you all for joining us for the third installment of the State of Horned Lizard Conservation series. My name is Mason Lee. I'm the current president of the Horned Lizard Conservation Society. Before we get started, just two quick reminders. This presentation is being recorded, so if you need to jump off at any point, it will be posted on our YouTube channel by tomorrow. And then if you have any questions, make sure to put them in the chat box during the presentation, or you can unmute yourself at the end of Dr. McElroy's presentation and ask then. And then one more quick announcement. If you're shopping, doing some holiday shopping for yourself or another horned lizard lover in your life, our store will be closed for orders on December 17th until the new year. So make sure you get your shopping done before then if you want some of our awesome horned lizard trinkets and clothes and boats that we have on our online store. So with that, we'll go ahead and get started with our presenter, Dr. Eric McElroy. He's a professor in the Department of Biology Chair at College of Charleston in South Carolina. His lab explores the functional and physiological basis of animal ecology, evolution, behavior, and conservation. Some of his lab's research has focused on the ecology of introduced Texas horned lizards on barrier island dune systems near Charleston, South Carolina. Today, he'll be sharing with us what they've learned about this population over the last several years. Go ahead and get started.
And 1 minute to clean this up a little bit, folks. All right, well, thank you for the introduction, Mason, and the invitation to show you some of the work that we've done over about the past decade here in South Carolina. And so I'm going to talk to you about some of these introduced populations of Texas horned lizards that we find in South Carolina, but also in some other places on the East Coast. Before I start, I want to acknowledge two people that played a huge role in this project. The first is Courtney Hiring. She was a graduate student in my lab that really was the boots on the ground that did, drove this project. And then Dean Williams over here on the right is a professor at Texas Christian University. He was responsible for some of the genetics, well, really all of the genetics data that I'm going to show you. I am not a geneticist, so he contributed that part to kind of give us this overall story that I'll tell you today. There we go. So the Texas horned lizard has a native range that is really centered in Texas and a few of the surrounding states down into Mexico. What is, I think, one of the interesting aspects of the Texas horned lizard is that throughout portions of its range, it is declining and in some cases considered threatened or even endangered. So for example, in the eastern half of Texas over here, Texas horned lizards have been disappearing over the past several decades. Other populations around the periphery, around these peripheries here are in various states of decline or extirpation. And so kind of in those areas, people are really worried about the Texas horned lizard, thinking about conservation. I know the state of Texas spends quite a bit of money thinking about reintroduction and breeding programs. And one of the reasons that I think that's so interesting is that historically, Texas horned lizards were actually introduced all over the United States, especially in the states surrounding the native range, the southeastern United States, and then very interestingly, there are some reports of Texas horned lizards like on the dunes of Lake Michigan. There are reports of a few animals that were captured there by a herpetologist. I forget who it was and exactly when it was, but these animals were kind of transported to various places in the US, introduced, and in some locations now have reproducing stable populations. Why were they transported? Why were they moved to all of these red dots from the native range? What we think and what past evidence suggests is that it was largely due to the pet trade. And so people think that horned lizards make fabulous pets. They're pretty cool looking. They're small, they're docile. These are pictures of my kids. Actually, they come out to the study sites and will help me capture these. A kid can capture them, a kid can hold them. Are you still there? Hello?
Yeah, it looks like you dropped off in your presentation.
Yeah, I'm sorry. Is it back up now?
Yeah, you're good.
Yeah. Okay, great. So, people historically thought these made great pets. And so that's one of the reasons we think they were transported all over the place. And as I said on the previous couple of slides, there are a few of these populations that have persisted. So we know of, I think there's a couple populations here in North Carolina. I'm going to talk about 3 populations that we know still exist in South Carolina. And in Florida, there's at least 2 spots that I know of that have these for sure, and possibly others. The spots with the red dots, again, those were historical introductions. We don't know if some of those populations still exist. I haven't seen anything in the literature, and I haven't personally went and looked, for example, on the coast of Georgia or down here in Alabama, Mississippi, and Louisiana. So there could still be some introduced populations in those locations. We just don't know. And so the populations I'll talk about today are along coastal South Carolina, and the 3 in South Carolina actually exist on the dunes on barrier islands, kind of touching the ocean. So they are on the eastern edge of the United States. And so we find these down here in the south at Edisto Beach, and then up here in the Charleston area at Sullivan's Island and the Isle of Palms. All 3 locations have reproducing populations. We find babies at all of them. We find pregnant females at all of them. And it's been that way, according to some, talking to some locals and some historical records, at least since the 1950s. So we don't know exactly when they showed up, but at least since like the 50s and 60s, these have been around. You talk to some people that were kids in the 70s, and they have these stories of finding, you could go out on the dunes and literally walk over horned lizards. They were so abundant out on the dunes. And so I'm going to talk about those 3 populations and some of the biology of these 3 populations. And so at first, so when I sort of first approached this in my mind, I thought, well, it's kind of unusual that horned lizards would be a species that could be spread and then become established elsewhere. Because when I think of a horned lizard, I think of a highly specialized animal that has a specialized diet, for example. I mean, that's one thing that kind of everybody that knows about anything about lizards, they know that horned lizards, they really focus in on ants. Okay, so pretty much all the species are focusing on ants. Texas horned lizards in particular focus in on harvester ants. So these are some data from various historical studies. And as you can see, Texas horned lizards, pretty much like all horned lizards, their diet is almost all ants. But even more, they're even more focused in that they are keying in on harvester ants. That's not just Texas horned lizards. There are other horned lizard species that really key in on harvester ants. And so that was kind of interesting in that we started to think, well, do we even have harvester ants on the East Coast? Are there ants on the dunes on the East Coast? Well, indeed there are. There's one species of harvester ant that's found east of the Mississippi River, and that's the Florida harvester ant. The Florida harvester ant is found on barrier islands, on sand dunes. It's also found really in any inland sand dune system. So Georgia, South Carolina, down into Mississippi, Alabama, there are sand dunes, old sand dune systems from sort of ancient, where the ocean was further inland. You'll find harvester ants on those dunes, on those old dune systems. We have those. We also have another species that is incredibly abundant out on Sullivan's Island, Isle of Palms, and Edisto Beach, and that is the pyramid ant, or Dory myrmex. And so these are a much smaller ant. They're probably about a quarter of the size of a harvester ant, but they are literally everywhere out on the dunes. So there's plenty of food out on these dunes. And what's interesting is when you start to learn about the biology of the dunes here in South Carolina, you realize that there really isn't anything else that eats these, that eats ants. Really, the only other animal that consistently targets ants out on the dunes is Gastrophryne, which is a species of toad, a frog. They're nocturnal, so they're certainly not going after the same types of ants that a diurnal horned lizard would eat. So, there's plenty of food available. The other thing about horned lizards is they have, I don't think they really, Texas horned lizards, they don't have a very specific habitat requirement, but they do need sort of an open mosaic habitat with a combination of cover in the form of debris and low vegetation. And then especially important for them is loose sandy soil so they can bury themselves at night and then when they brumate through the winter. Well, that's kind of the exact habitat you see out on the dunes in South Carolina. So these are 3 pictures taken from each of the field sites. And so the dune habitat is kind of a mosaic. You see lots of grasses, which the horned lizards, when you're out there, they'll dive into these grasses as a way to seek cover. There's lots of open sandy areas that they use to, they'll bury themselves in overnight. They will use that to bask in the morning. And then there's taller vegetation. So this stuff back here is called wax myrtle, which is kind of everywhere out on the dunes interspersed. It's a taller kind of a bushy thing. They'll also dive under that as a way to get protection from predators or from the elements. And so you see that same type of habitat mosaic in South Carolina that you would see in their native range in Texas, and even some of the same and similar species. So we have like a puncha cactus, and some of these other xerically adapted plants. And so given that we have these introduced populations and we see some of the same characteristics in the ecological conditions on South Carolina dunes, I want to lay out a couple of research questions and hypotheses that drove this study. And so the first is related to the genetics of this. So one thing we wanted to know is, where did these lizards come from? And with modern genetic techniques, you can figure that out with some precision. And so we're going to use some genetic tools to try to figure out where in the native range the South Carolina populations originated. We did a dietary study. So we looked at what they ate based on fecal pellet analysis. And what we expected, our hypotheses were basically that the South Carolina populations of Texas horned lizards are doing exactly what they do in the West. So they're going to eat mostly ants, and the ants are going to be particularly focused in on harvester ants, just like you would expect a population of Texas horned lizards in Texas. And then finally, morphologically, we expected the South Carolina populations to be fairly similar because, again, that habitat mosaic looks kind of the same. And their diet is expected to be kind of the same. So we expected things like the shape of their limbs, their body, and their head to look very similar to horned lizards in the native range. And so what I'll do now is I'll walk you through each of these and show you some of the data, the results, and what we've learned. And so with genetics, what we do is we took a fecal swab of every lizard we captured. We captured somewhere around 100 lizards across these different populations. And then from that fecal swab, we sent all these fecal swabs to Dean Williams at Texas Christian University. And he was able to collect some, to collect some genetic data on microsatellites and mitochondrial DNA. And so I'll talk about those data kind of all together. So these are 3 graphics that are giving you panel A, B, and C give you different ways of measuring genetic diversity. Okay. And so in all cases, what you see here is on the y-axis, we have a measurement of genetic diversity and just different ways of measuring it. And on the x-axis, we have different populations. And so, for example, Yocum Dunes Wildlife Management Area through Matagorda Wildlife Management Area. So these 6, these are all native range populations. And then we have our 3 South Carolina populations over here. So Isle of Palms, Sullivan's Island, and Edisto Beach are all South Carolina populations. And what you can see across all 3 of these panels, given these different ways of measuring genetic diversity, is that the South Carolina populations are consistently lower than really any of the populations in the native range. The only population that consistently approaches the lower genetic diversity that we see in South Carolina is Matagorda. Okay, so here Matagorda is a little bit lower than the other Texas populations. Here Matagorda for allelic richness is a little bit lower. And then over here for haplotype diversity, you can see Matagorda is there is no haplotype diversity, just like we see in South Carolina. And what's interesting of why I'm pointing that out to you is that of the populations we have from the native range, Matagorda is on a barrier island in Texas. So it could be that part of the pattern that we're seeing with this low genetic diversity is related to the introduction of animals to South Carolina. It could also be an island effect. Again, because Matagorda in the native range, we see that decline in genetic diversity associated with living on an island. This graphic gives you an idea of the clumping of populations based on microsatellite loci. Okay, so anything in green is sort of one clump, and anything in purple is another clump. So the analysis that was done to parse out these data found that there were two clumps that split the overall, all the samples of horned lizards, both from South Carolina and from the entire native range. And so those two clumps, the purple clump you can see is really mostly, these are all native range animals. So there's ones from Colorado, New Mexico, Oklahoma, some from Mexico, and then a bunch of populations here from Texas. And so most of those are purple, except when you get over here to the South Texas brushlands, all of a sudden you see a clump of microsatellite loci that turn green. And if you examine it closely, you see that that's what we see in South Carolina. So what this is telling us is that South Carolina lizards are likely allied genetically with lizards coming from this red shaded area in Texas. So it's the southern part of Texas, kind of the area around San Antonio, and particularly this place called Chaparral Wildlife Management Area, which will be important in a couple more slides. And so it looks like, based on this analysis of microsatellite data, that lizards in South Carolina originated from the southern part of Texas, or likely originated from the southern part of Texas. And we can analyze that numerically using a slightly different technique. And what you see is that this analysis up here, which tells us about, it's a variable called ancestry, which is like a composite measure. You can see that about 75% of the ancestry of South Carolina lizards is allied with southern populations, southern parts of the range, whereas only about 25% of the ancestry is from northern parts of the range. So that would be areas up here. So what this is telling us is that it's likely that there's a big influence from the southern part of the range, but it's not exclusive. There was likely also some genetic influence, meaning animals that came from the northern part of the range. And we're gonna kind of verify that with an additional analysis here. So this is looking at haplotypes that we find. And so this is a haplotype map. And what each of these are, each of these little circles, so like H26 is one haplotype. It's a kind of like a unique genetic signature. And so all the circles that are in white, these are all haplotypes that we find across the native range. Okay, so these are ones that we found in Colorado, New Mexico, across Texas, etc. And when they're connected by a line, that means that they are they're close to each other. They're genetically similar. So even though H32 is way far apart from H34, they're actually pretty close to each other because they're connected by this line. You'll see that there are two in red. The two in red are the only two haplotypes we find in South Carolina. So I want to talk about each of those. The first one is H08. H08 is a haplotype that you only find at Chaparral Wildlife Management Area, right here in the South Texas brushlands. And that was found in essentially every individual but one in South Carolina. So we had these data from 91 individuals, 90 of them had haplotype H08, and haplotype H08, the only other place in the world you find that is Chaparral Wildlife Management Area. So it's really strong evidence that South Carolina lizards came from really this location, Chaparral and the area around it in Texas. The other one is interesting in that H36 has never been found anywhere other than South Carolina. It's a unique South Carolina haplotype. And if you look at this haplotype map, what you'll notice is that it's closely connected to 3 other haplotypes. So H28, H37, and H30 also has a somewhat close connection here. And so if you look across the native range of Texas horned lizards and you ask, where do you find H28, H37, and H30, what you would note is that it comes from the north and western part of the range. So those other haplotypes are coming from these parts of the range. So remember I showed you that ancestry thing where it said that most of the ancestry, like 75% is south and 25% is north? The haplotypes kind of agree with that in that most of the animals we catch are from a south origin, but there's one that we caught and probably others, because we haven't sampled every individual, that are more north and west ancestry. And so it looks like the introduction that happened in South Carolina probably was predominated by animals from the south, either one or a few. And those animals have made up the vast majority of the breeding population at all 3 sites in South Carolina. Whereas there was maybe some that were introduced from the north, and for whatever reason, they didn't have a strong influence on the breeding populations and genetics that we see here in South Carolina. Okay, so that's the genetic data. What I want to move on now to is diet. And so what we did for our dietary analysis is we collected fecal pellets. Horned lizard fecal pellets. I'm talking to a bunch of people that are super interested in horned lizards, so I'm sure you all are familiar with these fecal pellets. These things, this is like one of the easiest things that I've ever sampled in my life. They are so easy to find. A student that's never done it before can learn how to do it in minutes, and they're everywhere. You can collect tons and tons of samples. And so I've collected over the years, I don't know, probably 500 of these. The problem with them is not getting them, it's turning this into what is in it. Okay, so what we did is we've collected lots of these, like maybe 500. We took 10 pellets randomly per site, so 10 at Sullivan's, 10 at Edisto, and 10 at Isle of Palms, and we dissected those and counted prey items, identifying them down to the lowest taxonomic level possible. That was largely done by inspecting ant heads. That was what Courtney Hiring spent the vast majority of her thesis doing. It was, again, a Herculean task to do this. And so in these 30 total fecal pellets across these 3 sites, she was able to identify 15,000 prey items. And so if you compile all those 15,000 prey items into a graphic of what were they, you get something that looks like this. So on the y-axis here is the percentage of diet made up of particular prey types. On the x-axis are the different populations. So IOP is Isle of Palms, Sullivan's Island is SI is Sullivan's Island, and E is Edisto Beach. And then different colors and hatchings indicate different genera of ants. So these 5 genera down here, these are all ant genera. There's a category here for just a garbage bag of other ants that were very low percentage. And then there's a couple categories up top here for other arthropods and plant matter. And so what you'll notice from this is that the black bars make up most of the graphic. The black bars are Dory myrmex. If you remember back from the beginning of the talk, I told you that Dory myrmex is it's called the pyramid ant. It's an ant that is extremely abundant on the dunes in South Carolina. That's mostly what they eat. They really do focus in on Dory myrmex. And then they mix in some other ants, kind of, we're not sure if it's opportunistically or if they're focusing in on them. We haven't really sorted out the what's available exactly at all of these spots. So Dory myrmex is the major prey item in all populations. The rest of the diet is really a variety of other ant species. What's interesting is I have yet to dissect a fecal pellet that has a harvester ant. And in fact, I said I've collected 500. I don't know of any of them that have obviously had harvester ants in them, even though there are harvester ants out there. And so I'll add sort of a tidbit here. I don't have a slide for this, but it's a little bit of a story of something interesting that we've noticed. So I had a student that came after Courtney. Her name was Kristen Gold, who actually did an ant survey, an insect survey at Sullivan's Island. And what she found, in essence, was that the percentages we see here are in the diet of the horned lizards are pretty similar to the percentages you see out on the dunes. So dory myrmics are the most common, followed by Solenopsis, et cetera, et cetera. She did capture some harvester ants, but they were very rare on Sullivan's Island. And so the diet of the horned lizards on Sullivan's Island looks like it follows the available ants. I've done a follow-up survey on another island in South Carolina called Kiowa Island. It's about 15 miles south of Sullivan's Island. There are no horned lizards on Kiowa Island. There are harvester ants everywhere. The most abundant ant on Kiowa Island is still probably dory myrmix, but its abundance is about equal to harvester ants. So there's tons and tons of harvesters out there. So one thing that we think might be going on in these populations is that perhaps historically horned lizards wiped out harvester ant populations or knocked those populations way back. And since they wiped those out, they now have switched over to the other available ants. And again, this would have been a historical thing, so happening over decades. We have no data to show that that's exactly what has happened. It's just an idea. And then finally, I'll show you some data on morphology. So we took morphological measurements from every individual we captured, which included limb measurements, so forelimb measurements, some hind limb measurements, and then some head dimensions. And then also not pictured here, we took snout vent length, which is it's just body length, body size, and then tail length. And what we did with those is something fairly complex. So we used some multivariate statistical methods. So I want to briefly explain how that works so you understand this graphic. And so we first took all of the morphological measurements and put them into analysis called PCA, which stands for Principal Component Analysis. And what that analysis does is it decomposes the variation that we see in all the original morphological variables into something that hopefully makes a little bit more sense. And you do that because then statistically, when you use this next analysis called Mancova, which is a way of testing if populations are different, it makes that analysis more statistically robust. So we used a PCA and then after that something called Mancova to test the hypothesis that the populations of horned lizards are different morphologically. And so when you do that, you get a picture that looks like this. So each of the populations is represented by different symbols. So Sullivan's Island are these blue triangles. The red circles are Edisto Beach. The green triangles are IOP. And then down here, you see a West Texas population in this teal color and a South Texas population here in the orangish color. The circles are 95% confidence intervals. So that's giving you a sense of statistical confidence in where that species sits on this graphic. And so one thing you should, if you take anything away from the slide, the one thing you should take away is the two Texas populations are clearly in a different spot on this graph than the South Carolina populations. They are anatomically distinct. Texas populations are anatomically distinct from South Carolina populations. What drives that distinction? It's driven by these two things called PC1 and PC2, which are combinations of the original morphological variables. And so what we see if we kind of sort this out is that PC1 is pointing in this direction. It's pointing towards the Texas populations. And snout vent length and head shape have a positive correlation with that PC. What that means is that West Texas and South Texas lizards are bigger and have a different head shape. They actually have an overall larger head than South Carolina populations. South Carolina lizards are smaller overall and have an overall small head for their body size. You can contrast that with this negative loading. And what this is telling us is that West Texas and South Texas lizards have shorter legs, whereas, or I should say shorter hands and feet, whereas South Carolina lizards have longer hands and feet. And I could try to come up with some adaptive explanations here. It would all really be hand waving. But if you remember, the diet was different in these, and diet is related to head shape in many different lizard species. So some of the head shape differences we see could be related to this dietary difference of eating a big harvester ant versus a lot more numerous and smaller pyramid ants. PC3 was also important. I'm not going to dig into that. I just put it there to be kind of complete in terms of the two axes that were most important. And these are statistically significantly different. And so again, Texas is different from South Carolina. And I didn't mention this. This analysis was just for adult females. On the next slide, I'm going to show you adult males. The story is the same. The details are a bit different. So Texas lizards are different from South Carolina lizards. You'll notice there's only one population of Texas lizards. That's because we were unable to capture males from the South Texas population simply because of time constraints in terms of Courtney being able to go out there and get the samples. And you'll see that the measurements here are a bit different in terms of what drives these differences, but the story's the same. These populations are morphologically distinct. Okay, so to summarize everything I've just told you, and to kind of go back to our original questions and tie it into the hypotheses, our first question was really where do these South Carolina populations come from? And I think we have a pretty good answer in that it's probably from South Texas. That seems to be the majority of the genetics that we see in South Carolina. But there's some evidence that there may be North or West Texas influence, a small influence on the South Carolina populations. Diet, South Carolina horned lizards, Texas horned lizards are like native range Texas horned lizards. They eat ants. They're different though in that they don't eat harvester ants. At least the populations we examined, the fecal pellets we examined, there were never any harvester ants in their diet. Instead, they've shifted their diet to a different ant genus, Dorymyrmex. And I kind of alluded to this on a previous slide, but the idea here is perhaps that ants represent an open dietary niche. And so horned lizards were introduced and either A, they ate all of the harvester ants and moved to a different ant, or B, historically, the populations that we study maybe just didn't have many harvester ants, but had lots of pyramid ants. And so horned lizards found their way here and just started eating pyramid ants because they're everywhere. Morphologically, remember our original hypothesis was that South Carolina populations are similar to Western populations. We can reject that hypothesis because, as I showed you in the previous couple slides, the populations in South Carolina are morphologically distinct from the ones in Texas. Why is that? Well, there's two plausible scenarios. One is that there's some sort of natural selection that's happened that's driven changes in morphology that could be based on this dietary difference. It could also be based on habitat differences. So the habitats are broadly similar, but we've not done a detailed analysis of, for example, the soils, the exact plant cover, the species of plants. Any of that stuff could drive differences, as could predators. We haven't done that analysis either to think about how predation differs in South Carolina. That could all drive morphological difference. Another explanation, though, is that we could be seeing something called genetic drift due to a bottleneck. So in genetics, a bottleneck happens when you go from a lot of genetic diversity to very little. That's exactly what's happened in South Carolina. Remember at the beginning when I started talking about genetics, we saw this extreme decrease in genetic diversity and also in haplotype diversity. And so what we could be seeing is a purely a random genetic effect where low genetic diversity is driving morphological change by random mutations accumulating here in South Carolina. We don't have answers to those questions right now. They're just ideas for future study. I'll point you all to the fact that everything I've just talked about is, you can read this in an article from the journal Scientific Reports. Courtney Hiring is the lead author. I'm a co-author, Dean's a co-author. These other folks in the middle, I want to mention them briefly. So Diane Barber works at the Fort Worth Zoo, and she was important for helping with helping get lizards in Texas, and also providing facilities for Courtney to take the measurements that she needed from Texas. And then Nathan, Devin, and Cameron were part of the field team that Courtney worked with while she was in Texas to measure Texas horned lizards, kind of at the very tail end of her master's thesis. And so with that, I want to acknowledge several folks. So I've already acknowledged Nathan, Devin, and Cameron. They are from the Texas Parks and Wildlife Department, which played a really important role in this project. The Fort Worth Zoo and Diane Barber were, again, important players in getting the Texas data. SCDNR provided permits to allow us to work here in South Carolina. The town administrators at Edisto Beach, Sullivan's Island, and Isle of Palms were all integral in giving us access. Working on sand dunes on the Atlantic Ocean is not easy because they are well protected. They don't want people walking on them. And these places were super helpful in letting us come in and study these lizards. Of course, I want to thank the Horned Lizard Conservation Society. Y'all provided a grant to Courtney Hiring back in 2015 to support part of this work. This is Courtney's thesis committee. They played a role in helping develop and really think about what this project was at the very ground level. And then anybody that's ever worked on horned lizards knows that it is really hard to find horned lizards, or it can be really hard. And so we had a huge field team, a lot of different people helping, including my children, another graduate student, couple high school students, and undergraduates from the College of Charleston. The best thing about working with Texas horned lizards in South Carolina is, you see that in the background there, that little blue haze? That's the beach with the ocean, the waves crashing. It's really, you know, it can be 100 degrees in South Carolina, but being out on the dunes, you get that nice breeze blowing in, and it's just a cool thing that these little lizards have somehow managed to make it on these dunes through weather patterns. They made it through Hurricane Hugo. So where this lizard sit was under probably 5 or 6 feet of water during Hurricane Hugo. And they're still here after that. So, and we don't know how that happens, but yeah. So with that, I'll take any questions y'all have. I'll go ahead and stop sharing.
So you just got a question in the chat.
Okay, I see it. So the question here has anyone studied how the Texas horned lizard compared genetically with other isolated populations? That's a good question, Ruth Ann. So I've been wanting to go to Florida and North Carolina to do some sampling. There is nobody in these spots that studies these. So in North Carolina, I've tried to get a hold of people that might know something about this, but there just isn't really any local expertise. Same's true in Florida. So they just haven't been sampled. Georgia, as far as I know, there aren't any populations. I have a few collaborators that do work on the dunes in Florida, and they said we don't see them. But every spot is unique. So for example, here in South Carolina, if you take a run of barrier islands from Isle of Palms in the north, all the way down to Edisto Beach in the south, you find them on Isle of Palms, Sullivan's Island. They're missing from the next one down, which is Folly Beach. Folly Beach is a total commercial, urban. You would totally expect introductions there. There were definitely pet shops. There was a military base. They're not there. They're not on Kiowa. They're not on Seabrook. And then they show up on Edisto. So you have to go to each of these spots and spend a bunch of time looking, and there's a lot of failure. We have checked one other historic population in Myrtle Beach. There are tons of these in Myrtle Beach historically. There's actually records from, I can't recall, he's a famous herpetologist, and I can't recall his name, Don Tinkle, who worked at the University of Michigan long ago. He had some old samples from Myrtle Beach. We've been to those spots. I would be surprised if any lizards. I don't even think we find race runners there because it's completely overrun by humans. So we don't know the answer to that. Let's see, Emily asks, do pyramid ants and harvester ants have any noticeable behavioral differences? I think harvester ants tend to be much more aggressive. So if you irritate a harvester ant colony, you are going to have some of the soldiers coming to let you know about it. And they tend to be large, bite, sting. They're pretty nasty. With the pyramid ants, they just kind of, they go into this frenetic, like chaotic pattern of running. but they don't seem to bite or sting, at least not in a way that a human, I've had my hands in them as they're going crazy and you don't get hurt. And they're certainly not like fire ants. So we do have fire ants. Horned lizards eat fire ants here. We don't know if they eat the red fire ant, the imported red fire ant. But the behavioral differences, like there are behavioral differences. I don't know how that might relate to a horned lizard targeting them, for example. See, the next question here is, did you observe differences in coloration in dune lizards? So here in Southern California, our beach dune Blainville's horned lizards are much lighter to match almost white sands. Yeah, and so Cheryl Jenkins asked that. We haven't looked at that. Just from my sort of cursory observation, there are lizards that are very light in color, but there are also lots of lizards that just look like kind of a normal picture of a Texas horned lizard. So they still have one thing about Texas horned lizards is they have the white stripe down the back that's supposed to mimic kind of grass blades. And then they have those, they're like ocelli or the black spots down the edge. You see those in South Carolina, Texas lizards. It looks very similar to the native range. Would be cool though to do one of those really detailed substrate analyses where you use photographs and use Photoshop to really quantify, you know, is there a fine scale thing happening? We just don't know the answer to that. Anybody else have a question?
I've got a question.
Okay, go ahead, Dalton.
So for your analysis on the morphological data, so based on y'all's genetic analysis, you pretty much said these things are really high probability of them being from, it wasn't Matador, which one?
It was Chaparral in South Texas.
Yeah. So for your morphological analysis, I'm assuming y'all did pretty much just even sampling across the range, at least from Texas. Did y'all look at anything like, so since that was the origin population, we think, any thoughts on using a larger sample size targeted at that origin?
Yeah, so a dream project for me would be to fly into Austin and drive around Western Texas with Texas Parks and Rec, and just every animal they catch, measure. So the Texas, I think we had maybe 20 or 30 total lizards from Texas. And so when we did that part of the project, we were much more constrained. Courtney flew out. She stayed for, I think, about 8 days. They went to 2 sites, and I can't remember the exact 2 sites. I think one was Chaparral and the other one was, oh, the name's escaping me. It's a well-known wildlife management area. It's not on the map on there either. But it would be really cool to go across the range and think about that. I did have another scientist in Texas that we had thought about doing it with museum specimens. So there's tons of museum specimens of Texas horned lizards from all over the range. And that'd be something I could easily do with the tools I have in my lab, but I just haven't followed up on it. But yeah, that's a great question. There's another question down here from Dustin Rhodes. He says, do you know the habitat management techniques for some of these important ant species? I do not. I will not pretend to be an expert on invertebrates or really even Texas horned lizards. I know a lot about the South Carolina populations, but there has been, especially in the past maybe 5 years to 10 years, a huge explosion in Texas with conservation efforts. So people thinking about techniques to keep, to make the habitat better or the ants better. Fort Worth Zoo's put a ton of money into breeding these things. And then figuring out how to release them. So there's a lot happening there. But I don't know the specifics there. Other questions?
Hi, hi, it's Dusty again.
Hi.
I have a question about the lengthier feet you mentioned and South Carolina lizards. Do you think that could be due to to like the sandy dune substrate, like just needing like more, almost like snowshoes kind of feet,
Yeah, absolutely. So one of the things that we have kind of looked at, but again, not in super quantitative detail, is that when you see dune-dwelling lizards, one of the adaptations that's pretty well known is that some dune-dwelling species develop these fringes on their toes to help them get better traction, like snowshoes. We actually looked at that pretty carefully with race runners that also live in the same habitat. They do not have any sort of snowshoe. Their toes look perfectly normal. With the horned lizards, I haven't done really careful analysis of their toes to see if the toes here in South Carolina look different. So are there more fringes or a difference in any of those details? We don't know, but for sure, longer toes, there's biomechanical evidence, I believe, that longer toes kind of help to help lizards do better in loose sand. So yeah, that could absolutely be part of what's going on.
Thank you.
I think there's one other question. Ruth Ann asks, do you share any information with the San Antonio Center for Conservation and Research? I don't think I've ever specifically done any work with them or contacted them, but that would be a worthwhile, it'd be worthwhile to do that. Yeah, I'll look into that. And Leslie Nosserman says, let's see, might be interesting to compare morphological descriptions, additional genetics, environment, and diets with the Texas horned lizards on Matagorda Island, since they are both island populations. Yeah, absolutely. That sounds like a fun spring break trip for me to take. Or summer trip. I'm a department chair now, so unfortunately I have no free time at all. But I'm hoping to kind of keep this stuff moving along. Students do tons of awesome work. Any other questions? I really do appreciate the opportunity to talk to y'all and to share some of the stuff that we've learned. I haven't done much with these lizards since Kristen left. We did a study this summer on wasn't actually horned lizards specific at all. I'm very interested in locomotor function in lizards. That's really my PhD was in that. And so Texas horned lizards are a great model for studying how burst locomotion. So when an animal they're sitting still and they take off, like horned lizards do that all the time. Turns out if you put them on a racetrack, they will do that repeatedly over and over and over. And even as they tire, they'll still do it. And so you can study how changes in limb function happen in a very repeatable, controlled way. Can't do that with race runners. They're way too crazy. You can't do that with most other lizards because they won't sit still. But horned lizards, you put them down, they'll sit perfectly still, right in position, and then they blast off over and over and over. So they're really cool model species for that type of work.
Would you be willing to leave contact information, email?
I can, yeah. Mason, could I email you contact information, and then, that can then be shared with y'all? Absolutely.
You can absolutely do that.
Yep.
Thank you.
Okay, well, thank you so much for talking with us. This was a fascinating presentation. I didn't know about all the introductions around the US, so that was really cool. Just a reminder for everyone, our presentation next month will hopefully be from a speaker from Canada talking about the horned lizards up there. So please join us then the third Thursday of the month, which is December 16th is when it will be. So thank you again so much, Dr. McElroy, and thank you all for tuning in, and see you next time.
Absolutely. Y'all have a great evening.
Thank you.